The gyri, remember a gyrus is singular, gyri are plural, and all these ridges are going to be gyri. So all across the cerebrum. Down the center here is the longitudinal fissure. That's going to divide the left and the right hemispheres. So that was the longitudinal fissure. The central sulcus is kind of hard to see on the sheep's brain. It's hard to see on the human brain as well, but it's going to divide the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. So if we look at the different lobes up here in front, the left and the right frontal lobe, on the sides, the left and the right parietal lobes, and then in the back, the left and right occipital lobes. On the lateral sides, we've got the temporal lobes, left and right. Okay, the other thing that you can see here is this, what some people call a small brain. That's the cerebellum. And then going across, connecting the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, are these worm-like structures, little spaghetti worms. Those are the vermis. V-E-R-M-I-S, vermis. So the worms that connect the cerebellum. Okay, so that was the superior side, superior view of the brain. Now we're going to look inferior side. This is the underside of the brain. And you can see the brain stem pretty well down here. It starts off with the spinal cord. And then when we get up to this first bump area right here, that's going to be the medulla oblongata. So we transition from the spinal cord to the medulla in this first poofing out. The second set of bumps right here is going to be the pons. Okay, so those are the two ventral parts of the brainstem, and then we've got the cerebellum right behind it. Then as you work your way up, we're going to be able to see some different things. Let me switch brains. This one has a really good set of olfactory bulbs. These structures up here, it's large, flat right now, but they are bulbs. Those are going to be in connection with the cerebral frontal lobe. That's going to have a connection with the olfactory nerves coming up through the skull bone, synapsing right there into the olfactory bulbs. And then there will be a tract running down that continues the information inside the cerebral hemispheres. But these bulbs are going to be what we'll consider, for labeling purposes, the olfactory nerve, or cranial nerve 1. Okay. And then we have the remains of the optic nerves. They've been cut away. These are where the optic nerves would have been coming out. So an optic nerve coming out this way and this way, going to the eyes. But now we just have this very last cut of where the optic nerves are. So this X right here is going to be the optic chiasm. When it's coming out from the eyeball to the chiasm, it's the optic nerve. When it's leaving the chiasm, it's called the optic tract. And then this X is actually the chiasm. Okay, so that was the optic nerve. That's cranial nerve 2. Remember, cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 2. I'm going to go ahead and switch brains again. Here's that optic chiasm. And it's a good landmark because directly behind it, posterior to that chiasm, this hole that I've made is showing where the infundibulum, or the stalk that holds the pituitary gland, comes out. And if I were to hold my brain as such, that would be the stalk, and the pituitary gland would just hang directly down that way. Okay, so these right here behind the infundibulum hole, and that just gets cut off when they prepare the brains. These bumps directly behind are going to be the mammillary bodies. And let me see if the other brain has a better view. So these mammillary bodies, it's kind of hard to see right here, but after we cut into the brain, let me go ahead and show you what it would look like. This little round piece right here is the mammillary body. And that would be the posterior border of where the hypothalamus is. Okay, and we're back on the superior side of the brain. Just want to show you what happens when we kind of pull back and separate the cerebellum. That's not a natural thing. You actually have to do that on purpose. If you look inside here, we have 4 bumps that you can see right here. This is part of the mesencephalon, the middle brain, midbrain. These are the superior colliculi, and below it would be the inferior colliculi. So 2 pairs of colliculi together, those 4 bumps make up the corpora quadrigemina. And that's one of the main portions of the midbrain, or mesencephalon. It's on the posterior side. You actually have to pull back the cerebellum. If we look on the inferior side, the part of the midbrain that you can see would actually be the cerebral peduncles, the footpaths that lead from the pons and medulla oblongata, all of that fiber connection up to the upper portions of the brain. Okay, and on the inferior side, the midbrain mesencephalon, just above the pons, you've got these cerebral peduncles. That would be the footpaths that lead from the medulla and pons up to the upper portions of the brain. It's hard to see them the way that you would in a picture, but it's just these regions just above the pons in the middle, corresponding with those colliculi in the back. So we can see a really good landmark in the middle here. This is the corpus callosum. This little arch that comes up here, and this loop, if we follow it like a circle, the inferior portion is the fornix down here, but this top is the corpus callosum, those fibers that connect the 2 cerebral hemispheres. And this membrane right here, it's a very thin membrane that's covering this hole, is actually the partition between the 2 lateral ventricles, the left and the right lateral ventricle. It's the septum pellucidum, and there's little holes in there, the interventricular foramen, that actually allow the fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles to pass through. I'm going to kind of tear through it so you can see how thin it is. Just a little membrane. And then when we open it up, if we look at the other half of our brain over here, we've got the same bit but no partition. I've cut it all to the other side. So here's the corpus callosum, and then here's the chamber, the opening, that's the lateral ventricle. If I just kind of pull that apart, you have a really good clear view into this ventricle. That pigmented area, this dark tissue right here, that is part of the choroid plexus. Those are the specialized ependymal cells that produce the cerebral spinal fluid. So you're going to find those in certain areas of the ventricles, and this is a really good example. Here's that other half where we had the corpus callosum and the septum pellucidum in front of the lateral ventricle. Down below, we have this really well-formed circle. It's a very circular bit of tissue, and that is the thalamus. Remember, there are 2 sides, a left and a right side. So if we cut straight down the center, we would say this is where the 2 thalami meet. So the interthalamic adhesion is that part we talked about that's missing in 30% of males, the connection between the 2 sides of the thalami. But it's a very good landmark when you're looking at a sheep brain that doesn't have a lot of differences in the tissue. It just looks like a big blob of tan tissue. So if you have the circle, that's the thalamus. Okay, the epithalamus is upon the thalamus, and it's going to go over the top of the thalamus, just a very thin line that's going to end here in this round structure, this other round structure. That's the pineal gland or pineal gland that produces melatonin that helps regulate your circadian rhythms. Okay, so it's pretty large. You can see here in the sheep brain. Big round circle is the thalamus. The smaller round circle behind it is the pineal or pineal gland. Epithalamus connects it. The third ventricle is actually going to surround this thalamus. So the third ventricle has connections that we can't quite see with this lateral ventricle on either side, but it's surrounding the whole thalamus, which is located in this middle region, the midbrain. So that's why it's also called the ventricle of the midbrain. and you can see a little bit of pigment down there. That's probably some choroid plexus that we can't quite get into. The aqueduct of the midbrain that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle is actually going to come down around the thalamus. It's going to be this connection right here that you can follow down. As we come down, it's going to go in between the rest of this brainstem and the cerebellum. So the aqueduct of the midbrain is this canal, and it's going to empty into this fourth ventricle, which is right here in this indent of the cerebellum. So it's right in the middle of the cerebellum that it indents, and the emptying of that canal is a more wide open space. That's the fourth ventricle. The canal, as it comes up, you can see this is where those corpora quadrigemina are in this mid-sagittal view that you're looking at down the center cut. This is the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Remember, that's the singular version of colliculi. And if this is the thalamus, this round circle is the thalamus, then below it is the hypothalamus. Right? So this region between the mammillary body, which I guess I haven't mentioned in this view yet, this round structure is the mammillary body. And these are the cerebral peduncles, the footpaths that we've cut through coming from the pons. So it's right on the other side of the colliculi. These are the cerebral peduncles, mammillary body, and then the hypothalamus. This is the optic chiasm that was cut through. So this little region, the hypothalamus, is responsible for all sorts of functions, and it does produce a couple of hormones and stimulates other hormones to be produced or distributed from the pituitary gland. This is where the infundibulum would be, and the pituitary gland would hang down from that. Okay, here is another brain half. We're looking at the cerebellum now. This white matter, these little tree branches that you see coming out, white matter into the gray matter, those are the arbor vitae, the tree of life. And that's the white matter within the gray matter.